I'm Vivian Lin, educator at LACMA. Today, we are so honored to have Addie Lanier, daughter of California artist Ruth Asawa, to talk about Asawa's life and her innovative works of art in LACMA's collection. This conversation observes the Day of Remembrance, which commemorates the wrongful incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Hi, Addie.
Hi, Vivian. Hello, LACMA patrons.
So just to start, Ruth Asawa is your mother. For people who are not familiar with Asawa, can you tell us who Ruth Asawa is?
Yes, I'm happy to. And you have to forgive me if I speak about my mother in the third person like Asawa, as if she's not related to me. Since maybe 2001, when I began helping her with her career, she's become so much more prominent that she's kind of transcended her relationship with me as mom. So I do say Asawa, and there's a lot of reverence there, but it's just so you know, it might sound a little strange. I am talking about my mother. In recent years, really since 2006, she's become one of the most important undiscovered artists of the 20th century. And it began in 2006 with a major retrospective at the De Young Museum here in San Francisco. She was born in Norwalk in Los Angeles County. And that's why our family felt it was very important that at least one of her important works is included in your collection because she's a local girl. And she was born to Japanese immigrant farmers and in 1926. So she was born just before the major depression hit. And then she was raised a young child during the Depression. And later on, when she decided to marry in 1949, my father was Caucasian, and California was one of the few states where you could get married. The law had just changed in 1949. So they came back to San Francisco, and she spent her whole career as a California artist. Her career was, she's considered post-war and contemporary art. Her career spanned about 50 years, a little over 50 years. And it coincides with this whole development of design, interest in design and abstraction that started really in the 1950s and goes all the way up through the 2000s for her career. She's mostly known for her iconic sculptures, such as the one that is owned by LACMA. And it's important for people to know that all of these were looped by hand. So she wasn't using, she might have used a plier occasionally, but every loop she fashioned herself, or she tied the strands herself by hand. And she was incredibly prolific. And that came about partly because she really learned to work incredibly hard on the family farm in Norwalk. And coupled with that, she really didn't sleep very much. So she was able to put in many lives into one life. She had 6 children, which we were all raised in San Francisco. She built a really large community of fellow artists that supported her. And early on, she was recognized in the New York gallery scene. But by the time she'd had 6 children, it really was impossible for her to have a California life and manage a career in New York because she had no assistants. She couldn't manage all the marketing, et cetera. So she left behind this huge body of work just because of her incredible work ethic. And since 2006, curators have really become very interested in her. And in San Francisco, the Bay Area, she is also really well known for her public commissions. So if any of you have visited San Francisco, she made the mermaid fountain at Ghirardelli Square. She made the Play-Doh fountain or Baker's clay fountain at the Hyatt on Union Square. And our estate has just recently published an audio tour, which people can find on the Ruth Asawa website, ruthasawa.com, if they want to go learn around the backstory about her public commissions. And so her public commissions begin when she's very much a mature artist, and it's about 35 years of her life where she's working with architects, other artists, the community to build these larger public works that are on view to the public. You don't have to go into a museum to see them. And that was very important to her. And then the last thing that was aspect of her career was that she was a relentless advocate for the arts in public schools. And this, I think, really stems from her early childhood, where during the Depression, the daughter of immigrant parents, she got to see puppet shows. She got to see opera singers who came to her school. She had art classes. And these experiences completely transformed her life and were exciting to her as a young child. And she wanted to be able to create that again for other children. So in 2013, she died. She was 87. She had a very long life. And today, the Public Arts High School is named for her in San Francisco. And there's also a permanent installation of 15 sculptures at the DeYoung Museum. So she's a very beloved figure in San Francisco and the Bay Area. And now she's becoming a beloved figure of national importance, international as well.
Yeah, Addie, it's so amazing to hear the different facets of her life and how much of a dedicated artist she was. We know that during World War II, Asawa and her family were incarcerated at the Santa Anita racetrack, where she took art classes with professional artists, and then at the Rower Relocation Center in Arkansas. Can you tell us a bit more about that period of her life and how she continued her interest in art there?
Yeah. Well, my mother was 16 when she was interned. And her father had already been taken by the FBI. And her mother and 5 of her 6 siblings were the ones who were left behind to run the farm. Mm-hmm. And then, they acquiesced to the order to evacuate or to leave their farm. So they lost everything they owned. All the farm equipment had to be abandoned or sold at a fire sale. And they drove themselves to the Santa Anita racetrack, and they were given 2 horse stables to live in for the next 6 months.
Wow.
They had to make their own mattresses out of straw. It was this quite kind of chaotic. It was the assembly center where they assembled the incarcerated Japanese families. But what was amazing for my mother was also interned were the animators from the Walt Disney Studios. And there were 3 in particular. It was Ben Tanaka, Chris Ishii, and Tom Okamoto. And she studied mostly with Tom Okamoto, who taught landscape painting. And I believe he might have even worked on Fantasia. I mean, these were major artists. And coming from the little town of Norwalk and then the farm, for her to be able to work with professional artists was this amazing experience. She called it, how lucky could a 16-year-old girl be that she got that experience, and that no other teenager across the country was having that experience. And it was the kind of the energy of the Japanese American community to try and set up some kind of normalcy for these children who were interned. And so they taught in the bleachers at the Santa Anita racetrack. And she says she drew 6 hours a day. She no longer had to work on the farm, which was great for her. she could have worked as a weaver of camouflage nets once they got some industry started. And she said, nah, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep studying the painting and the drawing. So she lives there with her mother and 5 of her siblings and also her cousins. She had first cousins there. So there was a large Asawa contingent. There might have been 12 children that were Asawa there. But then after 6 months, they're shipped across the country to Rower, Arkansas. And there they live in the tar paper barracks. It was this swamp and the dust and all that kind of stuff. But for Asawa, she was kind of used to all the dust because she grew up on a farm. And there were 2 amazing teachers who took small groups of students outside the camp to do sketching and drawing. And my mother was one of these people. Mm-hmm. And also because she was interned, the Quakers were very concerned about these kids these were American citizens who had been wrongfully interned. And so she was offered the opportunity of a scholarship to go to a college, as long as it was in the middle of the country. And so she chose Milwaukee State Teachers College because she was going to go to become an art teacher, the sensible thing to do. Mm-hmm. So she's 17 and a half. She gets on a train by herself, goes up to Milwaukee and works as a live-in maid and works in a tanning factory. But she gets to go to this college and take all these art classes and, ceramics and jewelry and drawing and all these marvelous things that she just loved. And 3 years into the program, when she's supposed to go do her student teaching so she could get her degree, they tell her they're not going to be able to place her because it's 1946 now, and there's still so much hostility against the Japanese that they don't think it's safe for her to be a student teacher.
That's horrible.
It's horrible. So once again, it's the second time in 4 years. At first at 16, now at 20, she's told, oh, you're Japanese, there's a problem here.
Not able to do her student teaching to complete her degree due to the hostility against the Japanese at that time. Asawa enrolled in the radical art school, Black Mountain College, in 1946. She studied design, drawing with the former Bauhaus master, Joseph Albers. Addie, can you tell us about Asawa's time at Black Mountain College? Here we have an image of Joseph Albers teaching.
Yeah, Black Mountain College was this amazing experiment that lasted, I believe it was 27 years, something like that, very short time. But my mother had 2 really close friends in Milwaukee, and both of them had already been to Black Mountain College. And they said, well, you can't get your teaching degree. Okay, come and join us at Black Mountain for the summer and take some classes with Joseph Albers. So my mother got a loan from a church in Hawaii, got on the train, went to Black Mountain College. And originally she had gone there to study weaving. She wanted to study weaving with Annie Albers. Mm-hmm. She thought she'd be really good at it because she'd done so many acres of string beans as a child that she thought that was almost like weaving. But Annie was really funny. She says, well, you can't learn weaving in a summer. Go take the design class my husband is teaching. So she went off to study with Joseph Albers. And once she met Albers, she never went back. I mean, she took every class she could from him while she was at Black Mountain College. And she really intended only to stay for the summer because she was going to probably have to go back and help with the farm and everything like that. And she ended up staying 3 years. So at Black Mountain, she said it was the first time anyone had ever asked her to think. She studied, besides Joseph Albers, she studied with really major luminaries of the 20th century art. It was Buckminster Fuller, the inventor of the geodesic dome, and Merce Cunningham, the amazing dancer. And another teacher she mentions as well as Max Dane, who's a mathematician, which really figures in her geometric shapes that she makes that are sculptural later on. Although, there isn't a direct through line, but it had to have influenced her. And The other thing about her teachers is they were profoundly philosophical. Albers was into Taoism and Buddhism. Buckminster Fuller is about universal, the cosmos, and these very big ideas. And kind of the idea of what you can do as an individual, that your life is almost as an experiment, and see what you can do as one individual human being to have an impact on your community, have an impact on the world, and to live with integrity to kind of yourself, your creative self. That is the highest calling you can have, really, is to honor your artistic self. So that's Black Mountain College. And the other thing that I think is very important about Black Mountain College is there were these independent women who were working as artists there, very different than American women. For the most part, your general average American woman. A couple of them, quite a few of them, were refugees from Nazi Germany, but they were working artists, and they had very strong opinions. And so that was the first time my mother had kind of been exposed to that kind of modeling too, as very powerful women. So the funny thing too about Black Mountain College is it had a working farm. And Asawa was one of the few students who knew how to drive a tractor. She churned butter. She worked in terms of all the vegetable farming. She ran the laundry. She was just like this amazing workhorse for the campus. And eventually she became like the student body president the last year that she was there. So it was a transformative experience where she learned how to think like an artist, how to see like an artist, and how to put art at the center of one's life.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
But she's like 20, from the time she was 20 till the time she was 23. She was at Black Mountain College.
In 1947, while Asawa was at Black Mountain College, she went on a community service trip to Toluca, Mexico, where she observed local artisans forming containers by looping wire. So this was a really important trip for her. Can you tell us what she learned on this trip and how this trip informed her art?
Yeah, well, she went on this trip, as a volunteer service, and she was teaching to children. However, when she met a local craftsman who taught her this technique of looping, because there were these amazing baskets in the market, Asawa had already studied with Joseph Albers, and one of his main focuses was that the importance of using materials in novel ways, doing more with less, ideas of transparency. There were all these resonances when she saw this object, which was a basic, simple basket. Immediately she understood, oh my gosh, that is something that she could explore and she could exploit in novel ways, because it was being used in a very utilitarian way. So, and she never really formally studied sculpture per se. She did say that later on in life, when she did see sculptures working or whatever, she was always more interested in the armature, which is, using maybe chicken wire or some kind of mesh on top of which people would put paper mache or clay or plaster. But as soon as that surface was put on it, she lost interest in it. She was more interested in the transparency. So this looping, it was cheap, it was wire, it was cheap, it was something where she could construct whatever form she wanted. And she said that it was like drawing in space. And to take a line, it's still a piece of wire. You can take a line anywhere. So that was very appealing to her from an aesthetic and an intellectual, conceptual point of view, although she may not have been able to articulate it because she worked so intuitively. But she understood that she was basically had this opportunity to draw in space. And then once she got back to Black Mountain College, she started making baskets, and she would give them to people. She gave a basket to Annie Albers that she kept her letters in for her whole life, her mail. She gave them away as gifts. But then one of her friends said, well, what happens if you close it up? So she just closed it up. And from there, it sent her into a completely different path of exploration, because suddenly they were enclosed and they were now suspended. They weren't sitting on a table as a basket does. They were now a suspended sculpture idea. So Toluca, Mexico looping resulted in these it was the germ, the seed that took her to these iconic forms.
It's so amazing to hear how a trip, as you said, a germ, a seed, then informed this, now her famous sculpture. I want to show this poetic wire sculpture by Asawa in LACMA's collection, Untitled S027, made in 1954. It has beautiful, intricate details. The shadows of the work are equally mesmerizing. We would love to learn more about this piece. How did the early discoveries by Asawa lead to the making of this work, and why is this work important?
I think this work is really very interesting. If you look at her sketchbooks, from some of her sketchbooks from Black Mountain College, she's drawing a hyperbolic shape, and she's drawing those in her geometry class with Max Dane, I believe. And this sculpture is made of 6 hyperbolic forms. So it starts here, goes into a neck, and it goes out.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see it by the necks. You can count the necks. There are actually 6 of them. And what's important about this work is not only was it kind of one of the first sculptures that was shown in a museum, because it was part of a group show in 1954 at the San Francisco Museum of Art, which later became the Museum of Modern Art. It's also an evolution of where she was trying to make cones. And she was trying to make interlocking cones. And the thing about when people don't understand about, or maybe they do understand about Asawa, but she was fundamentally always experimenting, always exploring what the possibilities were. And if you'll see at these, where the hyperbolic shapes, the large flutes interlock,
Mm-hmm.
that technique was something that she discovered through the process of making these forms. And prior to understanding how she could take a layer and interlock it with another, her looped wire pieces were never, the surfaces did not intersect. And after she's figured out this interlocking process, she's able to take the inside layer, move it to the outside, bring it back in, move it out again. And so there's this intersection of form which she develops for her later, perhaps more complex works, but they're also incredibly stable because this interlocking has given strength to them. And that's part of the beauty of them. It's not only is it the concept of coming inside, going outside, so the surface is always exchanging roles with the other one, but it's also that they're just much stronger pieces of work. Her sculptures are so highly revered that they are always cared for properly by professional art handlers. But when my mother was making these things and shipping them to New York, they would go in a cardboard box with newspaper. And you can imagine.
Really?
Yes, you can
It would
imagine.
not happen now.
You can imagine what would happen to them in
Yeah,
transit. And
yeah.
as if an art handler put them on the ground, they could deform. So people now understand that Asawa sculptures are always suspended. They remain suspended at all times, and then
Mhm.
done by really sophisticated art handlers. The other thing that is I mentioned to you perhaps earlier is that this sculpture makes the most amazing shadows of any of her forms. If you get a pin light at the bottom of it, it will completely explode the entire ceiling and walls with the shadow. So I hope that you guys have the opportunity to try that. And then the other
I
thing
hope so too.
you should know too is at the time that this was made, it's made out of three very different wires. It's iron, copper, and is it brass? What's the third wire on that? I believe it's brass. But anyway, it would have been a really kind of brightly colored sculpture. But for Asawa, the they naturally oxidize. Patinas, that's just what happens to wire when it's exposed to oxygen over a period of time. And so it's become much more uniform in color.
Mm. What do you think is the legacy of her work?
Well, it kind of keeps changing and evolving because
Uh-huh.
the more people study her, the more resonances people find and bring to the fore, and it's just becoming pretty fascinating. I mean, very few people have the opportunity to study their mother in depth, as I have.
Yes.
Her work is so utterly original, and it is so aligned with this intellectual and conceptual impulse that artists possess. She's kind of the artist's artist, she was always experimenting, always exploring. And once you understand some of the thinking behind the works that she created, your respect for her just grows tremendously.
Mm-hmm.
So, although it's true she was kind of dismissed as by the critics initially, they thought of her work as decorative or domestic. And they dismissed her because not only was she a woman, but she was Japanese American.
Mm-hmm.
And she worked in California, away from the whole New York art scene. And in spite of all of that, in spite of the incredible adversity as a child in her childhood, the financial struggles of being a working artist and raising a family of 6 children, in spite of those kinds of, and a lack of understanding, a prejudice against just her as a female, a woman, and as a Japanese American, she still managed to build an incredible life. And she was able to find people who supported her, like my father, who was a really supportive husband, like the mentors that took care of her and supported her, like Joseph Albers and Bucky Fuller and Merce Cunningham and Ani Albers, these people who had such a high degree of regard for her and she for them. And even though she wasn't recognized widely, she was recognized in her small little circle. And that sustained her. And the work ethic that she got as a child from being on this farm, where it really was 6 days a week of work, really carried her through her whole life. And she was such a generous person that part of the thing that she really wanted to share, which is a little bit funny, but she wanted to share the absolute joy of work and how important it was to give young children real opportunity to have an impact on their environment through work, through making art. So I think part of her legacy is and she was such an advocate. She was an advocate for this. But, you know, when she was interned as a 16-year-old, and then they didn't allow her to be a student teacher, she learned very early that there is no such thing as security. And the only thing that you can really have a guarantee over in life is what you do yourself with your time. And I think that was modeled for her at Black Mountain College by these working artists. And so that's what we should all strive to do. We should strive to use our time as we choose and not give it away for, you know, another person's mission, or, you know, just to try and make money or anything like that. That the work that we do should be meaningful to our purpose in life. And so right now her work is in major collections across the country, not only LACMA and the San Francisco and the San Jose museums, but she's at the New York MoMA and the SF MoMA and the Whitney and the Guggenheim. And the true legacy of hers is going to be the art of living, in a way. It's how you live your life, I think, is the most important thing that people who really study her life will take away with them. And there is this beautiful body of work, but really the highest art is the art of living well. And I think she managed to do that.
That is really inspiring. I've learned so much about Ruth Asawa's work and your perspective to your mother's legacy. Thank you so much, Addie. It's my honor to speak with you.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And we're so thrilled that LACMA has this in their collection.